Jake Morrison opened his eyes to the sound of metal creaking around him. The escape pod felt like a coffin made of steel and broken dreams. 6 days had passed since the USS Dakota exploded in the black void of space. 6 days of floating in nothing while his air ran out and his hope died a little more each hour. The temperature inside the pod had dropped to freezing. Jake could see his breath in the dim red emergency light that blinked on and off like a dying heartbeat. His water had run out yesterday and his food 3 days ago. The recycling system that was supposed to keep him alive had failed on day 2. He was going to die out here in the cold darkness between stars. Jake tried not to think about home. He tried not to picture his sister Carol waiting for letters that would never come. He tried not to remember the last time he saw Earth through the viewport of a transport ship. The blue marble looked so small and far away now. Everything he had ever known or loved was light years behind him. The Dakota had been carrying diplomats to the outer colonies when the Vorthak ships appeared. They came out of hyperspace like angry wasps, all sharp edges and glowing weapons. Captain Rodriguez had barely enough time to shout orders before the first missiles hit. Jake remembered running down burning corridors as the ship came apart around him. He remembered sealing himself into the escape pod as explosions lit up the darkness outside. Now he was alone with his thoughts and the steady beep of failing life support systems. The pod's computer had stopped giving him status reports yesterday. It was probably better that way. Jake didn't want to know exactly how many hours of oxygen he had left. Something bumped against the hull of his pod. Jake sat up as fast as his weak body would let him. Space was empty out here. There shouldn't be anything to bump into. Maybe a piece of debris from the Dakota had finally caught up with him. Maybe his oxygen-starved brain was playing tricks on him. The bump came again, stronger this time. Then Jake heard something that made his heart race. Metal scraping against metal. The sound of tools working on the outside of his pod. Someone was out there. Someone had found him. A new voice came through the pod's communication system. It didn't sound human. The words were soft and musical, like water flowing over smooth stones. Jake couldn't understand what they were saying, but the tone was gentle and concerned. These weren't Vorthak voices. The Vorthak sounded like broken glass when they spoke. Light flooded into the pod as the emergency hatch opened. Jake squinted against the brightness and saw a face looking down at him. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. The skin was pale blue and seemed to glow with its own soft light. Large eyes the color of deep ocean water stared at him with obvious worry. The creature's features were delicate and kind, almost fragile-looking. Human, the being said in broken English. "You are hurt. We help you?" Jake tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. His throat was too dry and his lips were cracked from dehydration. The blue-skinned alien reached down with hands that had 4 long fingers and gently helped him sit up. Other faces appeared around the hatch opening. They all had the same blue skin and concerned expressions. "Water," Jake managed to whisper. One of the aliens disappeared and returned quickly with a container of clear liquid. They helped Jake drink slowly. The water tasted strange, but it was the most wonderful thing he had ever experienced. As strength returned to his body, Jake looked around at his rescuers. They wore simple gray uniforms with no weapons or armor. Their ship beyond the hatch looked clean and peaceful. Soft lights lined the corridors and everything had smooth curved edges. This was nothing like the sharp military vessels Jake was used to. These people seemed to build things for comfort rather than war. "I am Zethka," said the alien who had first spoken to him. "Captain of this ship. You are safe now." Jake nodded weakly. "Thank you," he said. "My name is Jake Morrison. I'm with the human fleet." Zethka helped him out of the escape pod and into their ship. Jake's legs barely worked after 6 days of floating in zero gravity. 2 other aliens supported him as they walked through corridors filled with the sound of gentle music and flowing water. Everything about this place felt peaceful and welcoming. They brought Jake to a medical room where a female alien with darker blue skin examined him carefully. Her name was Yilna, and she spoke even less English than the captain. But her hands were gentle as she checked his injuries and attached strange devices to his arms and chest. Whatever medicine she gave him made Jake feel stronger almost immediately. "Your people," Zethka said as Yilna worked. "The ship that was destroyed." "Were there others?" Jake shook his head sadly. "I don't think so. The Dakota went down fast. I was lucky to make it to an escape pod." Zethka's large eyes grew even more sad. "The Vorthak do not leave survivors. This is why we had to be careful approaching your pod. Their patrol ships still hunt in this area. You risked your lives to save me," Jake said. "Why?" The captain looked surprised by the question. "You were dying." "We could help." "What other reason do we need?" Over the next few days, Jake learned about his rescuers. They called themselves the Kalari, and they were merchants and explorers. Their ship was called Harmony's Light, and it carried supplies to colonies and refugee camps throughout this part of space. They had no weapons except for small defensive systems. They survived by being helpful and staying out of conflicts. The Kalari crew treated Jake like family. Navigator Kelru shared his meals and taught Jake words in their musical language. Engineer Thako showed him how their peaceful technology worked. Dr. Yilna made sure he was healing properly and gave him clothes that fit his human body. Jake told them stories about Earth and humanity. He described cities and forests and oceans that the Kalari had never seen. He talked about human music and art and the way snow looked falling on winter mountains. The aliens listened with wonder and asked hundreds of questions about his distant home. 3 weeks passed like a dream of kindness. Jake's strength returned and his injuries healed completely, thanks to Kalari medical technology. But all good things had to end. When they reached the nearest human outpost, Jake knew it was time to say goodbye to the people who had saved his life. As Harmony's Light prepared to leave, Jake stood in the docking bay watching his rescuers ready their ship for departure. Captain Zethka approached him one final time. "We are glad we found you, Jake Morrison," the Kalari captain said. "Your people are lucky to have someone like you among them." "I'll never forget what you did for me," Jake replied. "If there's ever anything I can do to repay you, just ask." Zethka smiled with his strange blue features. "Just be good to others as we were good to you. That is payment enough." Jake watched through the station viewport as Harmony's Light disappeared into hyperspace. He had no way of knowing that he would never see his gentle rescuers again. He had no way of knowing that saving his life would soon cost them everything they held dear. Admiral Thokvel stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the destruction of another Kalari colony through the main viewport. The blue-skinned aliens ran like insects as his ships rained fire from orbit. Their peaceful cities burned bright against the darkness of space. It was beautiful in its own way. "Report," Thokvel commanded his weapons officer. "Kalar Prime is completely destroyed, Admiral. No survivors detected. All orbital platforms have been eliminated." Thokvel nodded with satisfaction. The Kalari homeworld had fallen in less than 6 hours. These weak creatures had no real defenses and no military tradition. They were merchants and healers, not warriors. They should have known better than to interfere with Vorthak business. The crime of the Kalari was simple but unforgivable. They had rescued a human from certain death. They had saved the life of Jake Morrison when he should have died with his ship. This act of mercy had marked them as enemies of the Vorthak Empire. The punishment was total extinction. "What of the refugee ships?" Thokvel asked. "Our hunter squadrons are tracking them down, Admiral. The Kalari are fleeing in all directions, but they cannot escape us. Their ships are slow and poorly armed. We estimate complete elimination within 2 standard months." Thokvel smiled with his sharp teeth. The Kalari had learned too late that kindness was weakness in this galaxy. Their gentle nature would be their destruction. Other species would see what happened to those who helped humanity. Fear would keep them in line. Back on the human outpost where Jake Morrison had been delivered, panic filled the command center. Reports of the Kalari genocide were coming in from all across the Outer Rim. Entire star systems were going dark as Vorthak fleets hunted down every blue-skinned refugee they could find. Jake stood in the briefing room facing General Patricia Hayes and her staff officers. He had been trying for 3 days to convince them to help the Kalari. 3 days of meetings and reports and bureaucratic delays while his rescuers died by the thousands. "You have to understand, General," Jake said desperately. "These people saved my life. They risked everything to pull me out of that escape pod. Now they're being exterminated because they showed me kindness." General Hayes looked tired and frustrated. She had been fighting the Vorthak Empire for 5 years and losing ground steadily. Her forces were stretched thin across a dozen fronts. Every ship and soldier was needed to defend human colonies from Vorthak attacks. "I'm sorry, Commander Morrison," she said, "but the Kalari are not our allies. They never signed any treaties with Earth. We cannot spare fleet assets to protect a species that chose to involve themselves in our conflict." "They didn't choose anything," Jake argued. "They found a dying human and saved his life. That's what they do. They help people who need help." "And now they're paying the price for that decision," said Colonel Williams, the general's chief of staff. "We warned all neutral species to stay out of the war. The Kalari ignored that warning. Jake felt his anger rising. They ignored it because they're decent people. They couldn't leave me to die even if it meant making enemies of the Vorthak. Decent or not, they're not our responsibility, General Hayes said firmly. Our job is to protect human colonies and human citizens. I will not risk Earthfleet assets for aliens who made their own choices. Jake left the briefing room feeling sick and helpless. Outside in the corridor, he leaned against the wall and tried to control his emotions. Somewhere out there, Captain Zeth Ka and his crew were running for their lives. Dr. Yilna, who had healed his injuries, was probably dead already. Navigator Kelru, who had shared his food, was being hunted like an animal. Commander Morrison? Jake looked up to see Lieutenant Lisa Carter approaching him. She was a Marine who had arrived on the outpost just yesterday. Her face showed the same haunted expression that Jake felt in his own heart. I heard about your meeting with the General, Lisa said quietly. I wanted you to know that you're not alone in this. What do you mean? Lisa looked around to make sure no one was listening, then moved closer. I was saved by the Kalari too. 6 months ago, my transport crashed on an asteroid in the Rigel system. A Kalari medical ship found me and kept me alive for 2 weeks until human rescue arrived. They didn't have to help me, but they did it anyway. Jake stared at her in surprise. You were rescued by them too? Not just me, Lisa said. I've been asking around since I got here. There are others. Engineer Bobby Chen from the mining platform disaster. Pilot Amanda Brooks from the fighter squadron that got shot down near Vega. At least a dozen people on this station alone owe their lives to Kalari kindness. And now we're supposed to just watch them die? Lisa's expression hardened. Not if I have anything to say about it. There are people gathering tonight in Cargo Bay 7. Unofficial meeting. People who remember what the Kalari did for them. You should come. That night, Jake found himself in a dimly lit cargo bay surrounded by 30 other humans. Some wore military uniforms, others were civilians who worked on the station. All of them had one thing in common. They had been saved by the Kalari at some point in their lives. Bobby Chen spoke first. His mining platform had lost life support during a reactor accident. A Kalari merchant ship had responded to their distress call and evacuated the entire crew. They didn't ask for payment, Bobby said. They didn't ask what was in it for them. They just helped because we needed help. Amanda Brooks told her story next. Her fighter squadron had been ambushed by Vorthak raiders. She was the only survivor, floating in a damaged ship with no power and failing oxygen. The Kalari salvage crew that found me spent 3 days repairing my ship, she said. They could have just taken me aboard and left the fighter behind, but they knew it meant something to me. One by one, the others shared their stories. A transport captain whose ship had been saved from pirates. A medical officer who had been treated in a Kalari hospital, a diplomat whose family had been evacuated from a war zone by Kalari volunteers. Jake listened to all of them and felt something growing in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was anger. Cold, focused anger at a galaxy that would let good people die for showing kindness. Anger at a military that would abandon its saviors for the sake of politics and strategy. So what do we do? Asked Bobby Chen. The official fleet won't help them. Command has made that clear. Jake looked around the room at the faces of people who understood what they owed, people who remembered the gentle touch of blue hands and the sound of musical voices offering comfort in the darkness. Then we don't ask for official permission, Jake said quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he was suggesting. It was mutiny. It was treason. It was career suicide and probably real suicide too. I'm in, said Lisa Carter without hesitation. Me too, said Amanda Brooks. Count me in, said Bobby Chen. Around the room, voices joined the chorus. People who had been saved by alien kindness, volunteering to risk everything to return the favor. Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since his rescue. He felt hope. Jake Morrison stood in the abandoned mining station 3 weeks after that first meeting in Cargo Bay 7. What had started as 30 desperate people had grown into something much larger. Word had spread through unofficial channels across human space. People who owed their lives to the Kalari were coming together in secret. The mining station orbited a dead planet in an empty system. It had been abandoned for 10 years after the ore ran out. Now it served as a hidden base for what they called themselves, the Returned. People who had been given back their lives by Kalari kindness and refused to abandon their saviors. Captain Steve Martinez arrived with his entire crew aboard the freight hauler New Horizon. His convoy had been attacked by pirates 2 years ago. Everyone thought they were dead until a Kalari rescue ship pulled them from the wreckage. My wife got her husband back because of them, Steve told Jake. My kids got their father back. I can't just sit here while they die. Chief Petty Officer Rachel Kim brought her engineering team from the naval shipyard at Alpha Centauri. They had been working on a reactor that went critical without warning. The explosion should have killed them all, but a Kalari medical team had been visiting the station for a technology exchange. They stayed in the radiation zone for 6 hours to pull us out, Rachel explained. 6 hours of deadly exposure to save human lives they didn't even know. The stories kept coming. Colonel Dan Foster had fought alongside Kalari volunteers during the border wars. His battalion had been trapped behind enemy lines for 3 weeks. The Kalari had smuggled supplies and medical aid to them through Vorthak patrols. They're not warriors, Dan said, but they're braver than any soldier I've ever met. Dr. Nancy Walsh arrived from the research station at Barnard Star. Her team had been studying alien diseases when a plague broke out in the lab. The Kalari Medical School had sent their best doctors to help contain the outbreak. They risked infection to save us, she told Jake. Some of them died from diseases they had no immunity to. Even civilians were joining the cause. Tony Garcia was a schoolteacher whose daughter had been born with a rare genetic condition. Human medicine could do nothing for her. The Kalari had experimental treatments that saved the little girl's life. She's 8 years old now and perfectly healthy, Tony said with tears in his eyes. Without them, I would have buried my baby daughter. Jake watched the gathering grow and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. These people were looking to him for leadership. They expected him to have a plan to save an entire species from extinction. He was just one man who had been lucky enough to survive when his ship exploded. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Johnson solved their first problem. She worked in fleet logistics and had access to the shipyards where old vessels were stored. There are dozens of mothballed ships out there, she told Jake. Cruisers and destroyers that were retired but not scrapped. Some of them just need basic repairs to be spaceworthy again. Captain Ron Davis brought his squadron of heavy fighters. They had been assigned to patrol duty in a safe sector, but Ron had convinced his pilots to join the rescue mission instead. We'll be listed as missing in action, he said. But we were already dead men anyway. The Kalari saved half my squadron from a Vorthak ambush last year. Chief Engineer Kate Williams organized supply lines through the black market. Weapons dealers who normally sold to pirates and smugglers were donating equipment when they heard about the mission. Everyone knows someone who was saved by the Kalari, Kate explained. These blue-skinned angels have been helping people for decades. Now it's time to help them. The fleet grew slowly and carefully. Ships appeared at the mining station under cover of darkness. Old warships that had been declared surplus were quietly reactivated. Transport vessels were converted into makeshift destroyers. Fighter squadrons arrived with full fuel and ammunition loads that would never be reported missing. Jake found himself commanding something that had never existed before in human history. A volunteer fleet with no official authority and no government backing. Soldiers and civilians working together for a cause they all believed in. People who were willing to risk everything to repay a debt of kindness. The biggest challenge was finding the Kalari survivors. The Vorthak hunter fleets had scattered the refugees across dozens of star systems. Small groups of survivors were hiding in asteroid fields and abandoned colonies. Others had taken shelter with neutral species who risked their own destruction by helping. Intelligence came from unexpected sources. Smugglers who had been helped by Kalari traders shared information about refugee camps. Scientists who had worked with Kalari researchers passed along coordinates of hidden bases. Even some Vorthak deserters provided information about their own fleet movements. Jake studied the star charts in the abandoned mining station's command center. Red marks showed confirmed Vorthak positions. Blue marks indicated possible Kalari refugee locations. The pattern that emerged was heartbreaking. The survivors were scattered and terrified, running from system to system with no safe harbor. How many ships do we have now? Jake asked Sarah Johnson. 147 vessels of various classes, Sarah replied. About 60 are real warships. The rest are armed transports and converted civilian craft. We have roughly 30,000 volunteers, including former military personnel and civilian specialists. Jake nodded grimly. It was a respectable force, but they would be fighting the entire Vorthak hunter fleet. Admiral Thockville commanded over 200 ships designed specifically for war. The odds were not good. What about official support? Asked Colonel Foster. General Hayes has made it clear that any military personnel who join us will be court-martialed, Jake said. But I've been getting unofficial messages from some fleet commanders. They can't openly support us, but they might be slow to respond if we encounter trouble in their sectors. Dr. Walsh looked up from her medical reports. I've been analyzing the Kalari refugee patterns. Most of the survivors are being driven toward the Corvus Nebula. The Vorthak are herding them like animals into a trap. Jake studied the nebula on the star chart. It was a massive cloud of gas and dust that would interfere with sensors and communications. Perfect place for a final battle where the Vorthak could eliminate the last Kalari without witnesses. That's where we'll make our stand, Jake decided. The Vorthak want to finish their genocide in the nebula. We'll be waiting for them. Around the command center, the leaders of the returned nodded their agreement. They knew the risks. They knew most of them would probably die in the nebula. But they also knew that some debts could only be repaid with blood and sacrifice. The Kalari had saved them when they were helpless and alone. Now it was time to return the favor. The captured Vorthak heavy cruiser Liberation emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kethla system, like a ghost from the past. Jake Morrison stood on its bridge watching the tactical display show enemy positions. 3 Vorthak destroyers orbited the mining colony, where 3,000 Kalari civilians waited to die. Admiral Thok-Vel had made a mistake when he scattered his hunter fleets across Kalari space. His ships were designed to terrorize defenseless targets, not fight determined opponents. The Vorthak had grown lazy and careless in their genocide. They never expected humans to mount an unauthorized rescue operation. All ships report ready, Commander, said Sarah Johnson from the communications station. The returned fleet had jumped into the system in 3 waves to avoid detection. 147 ships now hung in space behind the largest asteroid in the system. Jake looked at the faces around him on the bridge. These were people who had given up everything to be here. Captain Steve Martinez had abandoned his freight routes and risked his crew's lives. Colonel Dan Foster had disobeyed direct orders from his superiors. Dr. Nancy Walsh had left her research to become a combat medic on a warship. Remember why we're here? Jake said over the fleet communication channel. Those people down there saved our lives when we needed help. Today we return the favor. The battle plan was simple because it had to be. The Vorthak ships were positioned around the colony like executioners preparing for a mass killing. The returned would hit them fast and hard before they could organize a proper defense. Speed and surprise were their only advantages. All ships, this is Morrison, Jake announced. Execute rescue protocol now. The Liberation led the charge, followed by the converted transport New Horizon and 40 other ships. They came out of the asteroid field at full speed with weapons blazing. The Vorthak destroyers were caught completely off guard. Their shields were down and their crews were focused on the helpless colony below. Steve Martinez brought his converted freighter in low and fast, using the colony's atmosphere to mask his approach. The New Horizon had been fitted with military-grade weapons by Kate Williams and her black market suppliers. It hit the nearest Vorthak destroyer with everything it had while Steve screamed over the communication channel, "This is for Captain Zeth Ka and the crew of Harmony's Light." The destroyer's hull cracked under the assault, spilling atmosphere and debris into space. Its crew had no time to react before a second wave of human ships arrived. Fighter squadrons led by Captain Ron Davis swept through the wreckage, hunting down escape pods and preventing any Vorthak from sending warning signals. Jake watched the battle unfold from the Liberation's command center. The ship had been captured 6 months ago during a raid on a Vorthak supply convoy. Its original crew was dead, and its computer systems had been reprogrammed by human technicians. The irony was not lost on anyone. They were using Vorthak weapons to save the people the Vorthak wanted to exterminate. The second Vorthak destroyer tried to run when it saw its companion destroyed. Colonel Foster's squadron of heavy cruisers caught it before it could reach hyperspace. The enemy ship died in a ball of fire that lit up the darkness between the stars. Its death cry was broadcast on all frequencies, a message of defiance from humans who refused to abandon their friends. The third destroyer made the mistake of fighting back. Its captain was either brave or stupid enough to engage the entire returned fleet in single combat. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, nothing remained but glowing debris and the satisfaction of a debt partially repaid. Kalari Colony. This is Commander Morrison of the Human Rescue Fleet. Jake broadcast to the surface. You are now under our protection. We're here to evacuate you to safety." The response came back in the musical language of the Kalari, followed by broken English. "Human friends, we did not expect you to come for us. We thought we were forgotten." "The Kalari are never forgotten," Jake replied. "You saved our lives. Now we save yours." The evacuation took 12 hours. Transport ships landed at the colony, while warships patrolled the system perimeter. 3,000 Kalari civilians, men, women, and children, were loaded aboard human vessels with whatever belongings they could carry. Many of them wept when they saw their rescuers. Some recognized humans they had saved in the past. Jake walked through the refugee camps that had been set up in the transport holds. Blue-skinned families huddled together with their few possessions, still unable to believe they were safe. Children with large, frightened eyes clung to their parents. Elderly Kalari who had lived through centuries of peace now faced extinction because they had shown kindness to strangers. "Commander Morrison?" A familiar voice spoke behind him. Jake turned and felt his heart skip. Captain Zethka stood there, older and thinner than before, but alive. The Kalari who had saved Jake's life had somehow survived the genocide that claimed his homeworld. "Captain," Jake said, struggling to control his emotions. "I thought you were dead." "Many of us are dead," Zethka replied sadly. "But some survive. We flee from system to system, always running, always hiding. We did not think anyone would come to help us." "We came as soon as we could," Jake said. "I'm sorry it took so long." Zethka's large eyes showed confusion. "You risk your lives for us. You defy your own government to save people who are not your species. Why do you do this?" Jake looked around at the refugees filling the transport hold. Families torn apart by war, civilians who had never hurt anyone, people whose only crime was showing mercy to dying humans. "Because you would do the same for us," Jake said simply. The rescue at Kethla was just the beginning. Intelligence gathered from the colony's computers revealed the locations of other refugee camps. The returned fleet moved through Kalari space like avenging angels, appearing wherever survivors were in danger. Each victory brought more people to safety and more volunteers to their cause. Word of the human rescue fleet spread through the underground networks that helped refugees survive. Kalari survivors began sending distress signals specifically requesting help from the humans who had come back for them. Other species started offering aid, inspired by the example of people who risked everything to help their friends. But Admiral Thokvel was not going to let the humans interfere with his genocide. The Vorthak Empire began concentrating its hunter fleets, preparing for a final battle that would eliminate both the Kalari refugees and their human protectors. The war was far from over. The real test was still to come. The edge of Vorthak space looked like a graveyard of broken dreams when Jake Morrison's fleet arrived. 50,000 Kalari refugees floated in barely functional transport ships, surrounded by Admiral Thokvel's grand fleet of 200 warships. The Vorthak had driven the survivors here like hunters cornering wounded animals for the final kill. Jake stood on the bridge of the Liberation watching the massive enemy formation through the viewport. The Vorthak ships were arranged in perfect battle lines, their weapons trained on the helpless refugee convoy. Admiral Thokvel had gathered his scattered hunter fleets for this moment, the complete extinction of the Kalari species. "How many ships do we have now?" Jake asked Sarah Johnson. 312 vessels, Commander," Sarah replied. "Word of our rescue mission spread through the fleet faster than command could stop it. Ships have been arriving late to their patrol assignments and getting lost on their way to other sectors." Jake nodded grimly. Even some official commanders had quietly redirected their forces, claiming navigation errors and equipment failures. The brass couldn't openly support the mission, but they weren't trying very hard to stop it either. The story of humans risking everything to save their alien friends had captured the imagination of people across the galaxy. Captain Steve Martinez appeared on the communication screen from the bridge of New Horizon. His converted freighter had become the unofficial flagship of the civilian volunteers. "Jake, we're picking up distress signals from the refugee ships. Their life support systems are failing. We don't have much time." "Understood, Steve," Jake replied. "All ships prepare for final engagement." Dr. Nancy Walsh looked up from her medical station. "I'm reading massive energy signatures from the Vorthak fleet. They're charging their weapons for orbital bombardment. They plan to vaporize the refugees from long range." Jake felt cold anger settle in his chest. The Vorthak weren't content with just killing the Kalari. They wanted to erase them completely, leaving no trace that the species had ever existed. It was genocide on a scale that made his human soul burn with rage. "All ships, this is Morrison," Jake announced over the fleet communication channel. "The enemy wants to finish what they started. They want to murder 50,000 innocent people, whose only crime was showing kindness to strangers. We're not going to let that happen." The returned fleet moved into attack formation with practiced precision. Months of fighting together had turned them into a real military force. Human warships took point positions while converted civilian vessels provided support. Fighter squadrons spread out in protective screens around the larger ships. Admiral Thocqueville watched the approaching human fleet from his flagship Dominion with cold satisfaction. These foolish humans had gathered their forces in one place, making his job easier. He would destroy their unauthorized fleet and eliminate the Kalari refugees in a single glorious battle. "All ships target the human vessels," Thocqueville commanded. "Leave no survivors. These insects need to learn the price of defying the Vorthak Empire." The space between the two fleets erupted in fire and death as the largest battle of the war began. Vorthak plasma cannons reached out across the void, met by human missile salvos and laser batteries. Ships on both sides died in seconds, their hulls cracking open to spill crew and atmosphere into the vacuum. Jake gripped his command chair as the Liberation shook under enemy fire. Around him, the bridge crew worked frantically to coordinate the battle. Sarah Johnson called out damage reports while Dr. Walsh treated wounded personnel. These people had become his family over the months of fighting together. Captain Ron Davis led his fighter squadron through the enemy formation like a knife cutting through armor. His pilots had trained for this moment, knowing they might not survive but determined to save the Kalari who had once saved them. They flew with the fury of people repaying a sacred debt. The converted civilian ships proved their worth in the chaos of battle. Tony Garcia's modified transport rammed a Vorthak cruiser at full speed, sacrificing himself to protect a refugee ship. Engineer Kate Williams brought her supply vessel alongside an enemy destroyer and detonated its cargo hold, taking both ships out in a massive explosion. Colonel Dan Foster coordinated the Marine boarding actions that turned the tide of battle. Human soldiers in powered armor carved through Vorthak ships, fighting with the determination of people who knew they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were the conscience of humanity made manifest. The battle raged for 6 hours across a volume of space larger than most solar systems. Ships died by the dozen as weapons that could crack planets tore through armor plating like paper. But slowly, inevitably, the human fleet began to win. The Vorthak had superior numbers, but the humans had superior motivation. Admiral Thocqueville made his final stand aboard the Dominion as his fleet crumbled around him. The massive flagship was the most powerful ship in Vorthak space, armed with weapons that could destroy entire cities. But it was just one ship against hundreds of humans who refused to give up. Jake Morrison led the final boarding action personally, fighting through the ship's corridors with a fury born of months of helpless rage. He had watched too many good people die because they showed kindness to strangers. He had seen too many Kalari families torn apart by senseless hatred. The bridge of the Dominion was a scene of carnage when Jake finally reached it. Admiral Thocqueville lay dying among his broken command crew, his sharp teeth stained with his own blood. The architect of genocide looked up at his human killer with eyes full of confused hatred. "Why?" Thocqueville whispered. "They are not even your species. Why do you die for them?" Jake looked down at the dying admiral with cold satisfaction. "Because that's what humans do. We protect our friends." When the shooting finally stopped, the space around the refugee convoy was filled with the wreckage of 2 fleets. The Vorthak hunter squadrons were destroyed, their crews dead or captured. The human fleet had paid a terrible price for victory, with nearly half their ships damaged or destroyed. But the Kalari survivors were safe. 50,000 refugees who had faced certain death were now under the protection of people who understood the value of kindness. Transport ships began the long journey back to human space, carrying blue-skinned families toward a new home among the stars. Captain Zethka stood beside Jake on the bridge of the Liberation as they watched the evacuation proceed. The gentle alien who had once saved a dying human in an escape pod now saw his people rescued by that same human's friends. "You came back for us," Zethka said quietly. Jake nodded, feeling the weight of all the lives saved and lost in this moment. "You saved one of us. We came back for all of you." The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson that day. You don't mess with someone's friends when those friends happen to be human. The Kalari would have a new home in human space. protected by people who believed that no good deed should go unpunished, and no kindness should go unreturned.